Here's another thing that would be obscured if you weren't really familiar with MGS1. We're looking at a throwback to part of what was released in Japan as the Metal Gear Solid 1 Integral package, an MGS1 version of the Substance expansion of MGS2, which was released worldwide. In the US, we got this in the form of a separate VR missions disc, a kind of separate expansion, which I'm pretty sure I 100%ed and got first place on all the missions back in 2000. Anyway, one of the creepy otaku parts of that package was a photograph mode where Snake had a digital camera. He started on the outer ring of an area identical to this, with one of the women in MGS1 in the center. The more VR missions you completed, the closer Snake got to the model, so it was this combination of voyeurism and encroachment that's an uncomfortable part of Metal Gear as a whole, really. MGS2 subverts this by placing Raiden in the center. The player's relationship to him, by analogy, is voyeuristic and even predatory. Raiden's distance from the player grows after the fight alongside Snake, and this sequence emphasizes the player's role as an outside interloper. It makes the nature of a controllable protagonist clear, an object of desire that we also control, much as, Rose was an object of Raiden's desire conditioned to respond to his preferences.
You ran from it, and now you've been led back to war by something less than real.
The strategy for fighting the Rays is pretty simple. Start off by distributing damage evenly between the 3 starting Rays before triggering the first one's jump into the arena. From there forward, get familiar with the rhythm, attack constantly, and it goes without saying, don't get hit. You'll get a breather for a few seconds when you destroy one Ray that's on the boss fight platform and it stumbles off, so whittle down the Rays on the edge so you can stack those breaks back to back. If you find you're getting cornered, you can throw a chaff grenade and slow them down, and that will help you get back in sync. This fight takes a good while. It took me like 10 minutes. So I'm going to take this time and close out with an extended look at postmodernism, MGS2, and the extent to which MGS2 can be called the first or most postmodern video game. I mentioned before that postmodern might not be a very good word because it requires extensive qualification, which was, admittedly it was a flip comment, less about postmodernism, and more about how casually and at times carelessly the word postmodern gets used. There are polarized feelings regarding the idea of postmodernism because there's a weird kind of cultural capital involved, which results in a strident, sometimes reactionary response that, might be avoided if it were simply called late modernism, which I actually personally think is more appropriate, but that's a semantic discussion I'm not really interested in following through on. The word postmodern is like MGS2's shadow. It follows the game everywhere, and it's sometimes described in degrees, as in MGS2, as the first postmodern video game or the most postmodern video game. I don't think those are accurate statements for a few reasons. The first is purely historical. When I read the word postmodern, my brain scans it as a synonym for contemporary. It's a name that we use to describe ourselves in relation to generations recently past. And those names can be unstable or unreliable in the long run to describe an aesthetic or zeitgeist. Anyway, when we use the word postmodern, we use the language of sequence. It puts us after modernism, which can refer to the cultural confusion following the collapse of empires in the late 19th century, among other phenomena. So as an historical signifier, then, postmodern encompasses the entire period prior to and up to MGS2's development. That's the time when video games sort of became more complex. So MGS2 is not the first postmodern video game because all video games are postmodern by definition. With that established, let's move to what I think is a more interesting overview of one possible meaning of postmodern as a term that describes a tone or a mode of communication. Postmodern can often mean a degree of digressive reference that removes us from what traditionally could be considered a real or substantial event or experience. Baudrillard's Simulacra is an example of this. I don't speak French, that's the best I can do for his name. A constructed artifice that refers to a constructed artifice of a referent. I'm going to develop off of one of his more well-known examples, kind of close to what's relevant for MGS2. So let's look at an emotion felt in response to a commercial for Disneyland. The commercial is made to elicit a response that reminds you of an emotion you might have felt or might imagine feeling in response to having fun at Disney World, which is itself a structure that repackages the nostalgia for tourism and primitive myth, and even nature in the form of a community park empire. Tourism, myth, and nature are the original things on which is built nostalgia, on which is built the repackaging of nostalgia, on which is built the emotion that you're supposed to feel in response to Disneyland, on which is built the emotion that reminds you of the emotion the elicitation of which is the purpose of the commercial for Disneyland. This kind of takes us out of aesthetics and more into the area of marketing, and this echo chamber of references is what kind of gets us to buy really dumb stuff. Modernist art is referential in a different way approaching this. For my literary frame of reference, the poems of T.S. Eliot are a good example. His poems provide a confusion of references drawn from literature and mythology in Western European traditions. Those references can create a sense of overload that expresses the anxiety underlying a loss of certitude that our ancestors once held in the face of questions of cosmology, ultimate meaning. They didn't have the jumble of values and cultural messages that we have today, and that jumble is one of the explicit themes of MGS2. Modernism has kind of mutated into a doubling down on the act of reference, and what's called most consciously a postmodern design, it often draws attention to the process or form of the very work itself. We call this self-referential quality postmodern, and that's the structuring idea I'm addressing with that term. If you read more widely, you'll find more nuanced discussions of the term, and I'm narrowing the focus to what I think is relevant to MGS2. All video games are postmodern for substance reasons as well. They're built from new and developing consumer technologies, and they establish their own context by creating their own rules. They refer to those rules as they coalesce into larger experiences, and they typically appeal intensely to the player's experience with the medium. They have to call explicit attention to it in some way for player training. This is reference upon reference upon reference, and only through these degrees of removal can we really enjoy video games without there necessarily being a shared or social experience. A lot of multiplayer functions respond to this need, since games have historically developed as forms of social interaction. But on the whole, video games isolate us from each other by freeing games from requiring other participants. Video games kind of augment the way that media cultivates individualism by removing private responses from the social sphere, much in the same way that the printing press and lay literacy cultivated individual moral responses to the Bible by making the encounter with God's Word private and read, rather than public and heard. The consequences of public dissent are often harsher and more draconian than the consequences of disagreeing privately, and we see the relationship between individualism and literacy reflected here. Video games protect us from the consequences of deviant moral decisions, like, say, killing hundreds of living creatures, some human, many not. A consequence of that degree of intense individualism is a sense of isolation, and we're responsible for responding to that. Ideologies such as fascism and different kinds of fundamentalism, they offer social structures built on non-historical or non-traditional ideas, and they provide a makeshift shelter that creates a sense of shared social identity projected as real or historically authentic, when in many instances they're not based in historic culture, creed, or practice to the point that, they falsify history in profound and radical ways. MGS2 provides a kind of medium-specific form of that conditioning architecture in the form of the S3 plan. Going back to the first example of architecture, the Disney commercial, we see a similar pattern emerge. The starting point is our experience with MGS1. So we really like MGS1, so we build the myth of Solid Snake on top of that. We create this idea of canon, this definitive nature of events. Sequels generally promise to indulge nostalgia for the original experience, so that adds another layer, the sequel as an expression of nostalgia. As already observed, MGS2 subverts this nostalgia by deliberately pointing to the MGS1 experience, and then denying its value as a map or a guide for what to expect from MGS2. MGS2 even deflates the validity of the player's experience with MGS1 when it shows an FMV of hundreds of Solid Snake models from MGS1 running in place, a visual symbol for how everyone playing MGS1 was their own Solid Snake in isolation, even though they felt like they were the Solid Snake because of the power of that experience. Adding the myth of Solid Snake compromises the player's experience that actually predicated the myth. The myth of Solid Snake points to a fictional character independent of player control, and there's a canon and a story experience that we all compare our experiences to. Did Raiden really kill Fat Man? Was Snake ever caught by the Genome Soldiers in MGS1, and if so, how many times? When canon appears, we have to disregard our experiences as authoritative. The myth cheapens the experience, when the experience is actually what's tangible and real. Not only does MGS2 use this idea of myth and canon to disregard the player's experience with MGS1, it also uses it to disregard the player's experience with the tanker chapter in MGS2. If we're playing as Raiden all along, and if Raiden experienced the tanker as a VR mission, as is established over the course of some of the codec dialogues, then it's plausible that we are playing as Raiden playing Snake in the tanker chapter. Even Snake himself comments upon the loose relationship between player experience and canon in MGS2 when he says to Raiden that he doubts that the VR regimen accurately represented what happened that night on the Hudson River. There's this idea that an objective witness exists, and that objective witness is removed from us even when we thought that we were participating in his story. All of this heavily hits patterns generally considered postmodern. Reference to reference to reference. The starting point of experience is discredited when canon replaces it. The authoritative version of MGS1 is something we never experienced, even though our experience is our only tangible memory. That tangible experience is no longer our starting point. Our starting point is canon. This is very much in the same vein that, the starting point for an emotional response to Disneyland is not myth or travel or nature, but a version of those things made more efficient. Fairy tales can have their gruesome qualities sanitized, and the presentation of nature lacks the necessary components of rot and death that give rise to fecundity. Likewise, anybody's poor performance in MGS1 is sanitized and given a special shine by canon to affirm that yes, Snake was a badass even though you yourself might have died a million times at the starting elevator until you gave the controller to a friend. What's real is better than what happened to you. That's what canon means in a story-driven action game. We'll return to that in a second. On this, Solidus is likewise fairly straightforward. The main things are to block and also to cut his missiles. After the first couple of knockdowns, if you're near him when he gets up, he'll dash away to fire missiles at Raiden. You can control this by running a medium distance away after he gets knocked down, so he goes straight into firing the missiles. This also gives you time to line Raiden up with the missiles by going into first-person view and facing Solidus directly. It can be difficult to line Raiden up from third person. To close out the broader point, though, the game's disregard of our very reason for engaging is deeply uncomfortable. I remember the motion-capped actor for Raiden in the document of MGS2. He commented that Raiden was a narcissist, and this seems like a pretty good way to describe the identity of the player in the way that MGS2 plays up our need to indulge that heightened individualism made possible in video games, while also frustrating it by denying that that individualism was in any way seriously consequential. The story was told independent of us. It pushes extreme individualism to its final point: nothingness. No way to socially verify that anything you did mattered, because the only thing that you're relating your actions to was constructed independent of your interactions. So, in these ways, MGS2 can be called a postmodern video game, because it makes its process and form the focus of its attention, and it makes us pay attention to ourselves along with our relationship to the medium. But aside from the tricks that it pulls in order to make the player disappear as an affecting force, which it does very well, it still requires a precedent. It requires a shared experience among players to have an impact. This leads me away from accepting that MGS2 is the kind of fully enclosed, self-referential experience that's often assumed by the casual use of postmodernism. MGS2 does not have an entirely enclosed nature. MGS1 exists prior to MGS2, and it works independent of MGS2. MGS2 took advantage of the first game as a pre-existing object for reference, and in so doing, it uses an historical precedent as the start of its pattern of reference. Here the philosophical and aesthetic critique gives way to the historical. We see that the patterns described as postmodern still require some external base, some shared experience in general terms, even if not in particulars.
Good work, Jack, but this is where it gets interesting.
The second half of Solidus' fight is easier than the first by far. If you get hit by his flames, just toggle the BDUs off and on to douse them. When you knock him down, create space like you did before, go into first person to line up Raiden and block however he attacks. Usually I was able to get him into a loop where he attacked over and over again with his elbow. This makes the second half of the fight the easiest on Euro Extreme, I think. To close out the broader point, MGS2, because it needs an external shared experience for its full effect, whether in terms of story, game interactions, or the holistic combination of the two, it's less enclosed as a full experience. The second game needs the first. As an example of a more enclosed game that is also a sequel, I'd look to, like, Super Mario Bros. It's much more exclusively self-referential. Its meaning is comprehensible as an experience without needing either Donkey Kong or Mario Bros. As a foundation for either its story or its interactive qualities. So, laundry list time. 1. Is MGS2 postmodern? Yes, all video games are postmodern. 2. Is MGS2 the first postmodern game? No, all video games are postmodern. 3. Is MGS2 the most postmodern game? Using self-reference and deliberately calling attention to form as a measurement for being more or less postmodern aesthetically, the game calls attention to its form only slightly more than it calls attention to the form of its predecessor on the PS1. So that right there weakens the whole self-enclosed idea. So I don't think it's necessarily any more or less postmodern than other video games. It is, however, a game about postmodernism and the narcissism of an enclosed loop. A situation we create for ourselves when we imprint our personalities on a blank slate protagonist in a video game. We confuse Metal Gear Solid 2's subject matter for its nature, when it is, I really think, at the bottom, simply an instance of a type. But it's certainly no less special for that. It's rewarding to return to time and time again, and I find new things each time I do, even if this is probably the last time that I do return to it in any kind of critical analytic fashion. So there you have it, Big Boss on European Extreme. Unfortunately, I forgot to record the rank screen, apparently, so I guess you'll have to trust me that I actually earned the rank. Or you can go through it yourself and the method will prove itself. I thought about earning it again, but I am no longer equipped to make it through the button-mashing choke sequence. Having mashed buttons for many, many years has taken its toll. So this is kind of goodbye to MGS2 on a number of levels. But, if you insist. And here's a picture of the whole family together. Thank you for watching.